Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well this week. Welcome once again to Global Management. And I do mean global management. If you are watching this video and you're not one of my students, then I think you could get something out of this video. But this is really geared more toward my students specifically. And the reason why is we're going to talk about how to choose a business for global expansion. What makes a business easy or more difficult in terms of expansion? So it might be helpful to you in some ways to watch this video, but if you really want to learn more systematically about this topic, then I suggest you look at the entry strategies video, which I think goes through that a little bit more systematically. Really, the purpose for what I'm doing here is trying to get my students ready for their project, which is hypothetically taking an international business and moving it overseas. And in the very first week of the class, it's sometimes difficult for students to figure out, like, okay, what business do I pick? What's a good idea? And so on. And there aren't any hard and fast answers to this, but I am going to go through with you some criteria and maybe some questions that will help you try to figure out what the answer to that question might be. So let's return to the logic of the entry strategy video. If you remember, there was a slide that I shared that talked about risk levels for global entry. So something like export, for example, is very low risk, low return. It's a simple kind of choice to make in terms of doing business. Much more complex, but also one would say high risk and high return would be direct investment. So, and then there's different things in between as well, right? We've got licensing, contract manufacturing, joint venture, franchising that are somewhere in the middle. And so thinking about risk levels would maybe be one way to start thinking about that. Next, I would think about ease of entry and ease of operation. So consider export, for example. Like I said, low risk, low return. It's also a lot easier just because there's very few moving parts, right? You take something and you move it, you sell it someplace else, or maybe you make it elsewhere and you sell it here. But the point is that you're starting in one place and you're moving it someplace else, and the transaction is not that complicated. Now, there is some specialized knowledge that goes with importing and exporting, and it's important to understand that, but there's also some great resources on that. There are also institutions, organizations, businesses focused on helping you with those kinds of things. And so you wouldn't have to know every detail, but it would be important for you to try to understand the process that you would go through in order to address some of those problems. Export, honestly, is one of the least common things that students select because they just don't know what they want to move from one place to another. So it might be a little more difficult figuring out what that product is. But I will say, as far as a business plan goes, a lot easier to put together the business plan if you can do something like that. Franchise is something that is much more common. Why? Because a lot of students like restaurants. They think it would be fun to sort of move a restaurant to another country, and so they'll pick their favorite one and they'll move them someplace. And that's cool. That's fun. And we'll talk more about that later, because fun and having a passion for your business, I think, is a very important thing. But there is a level of complexity that changes as you are when you get into the whole franchise business. Because think about this, right? Say you want to move a restaurant someplace, think about all the pieces. You have, where are you going to source your equipment? Where are you going to source your food? Is it all going to be local? Or are you going to bring it from other countries? If you're bringing it from other countries, now all of a sudden, you not only have a franchise plan, but you also have an import-export plan, because you have to get that stuff from other places and move it in. And a restaurant has quite a diversity of different products. So obviously you've got all of the stuff that you feeding people, but there's loads of other little things that also are involved in that, all the paper and all the extra stuff. So you've got a fairly complex operation. It's not quite as complex as some other things that students have picked before, things like box stores or grocery stores. Think about moving a major department store, or like the equivalent of a Target, to another country, and about all the different products and all the places in the world where these things are, and where are you going to warehouse this stuff, and where's it going to come from, and how's it going to get to your business. Again, that stuff gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. Grocery stores, likewise, loads and loads of diverse products, a lot of inventory, kind of a more difficult kind of thing. Now, I will say that just because things are difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't do them. People have done these things before. They have been successful. They've gotten good grades. It's just, I'm thinking about like, how much work do you want to put into a business plan in order to make it work? And I want you to know up front how much work is going to be involved based on what category of business that you're going to get into. So like I said, pick something export, it's going to be relatively easier. You start talking a box store and you've got like loads and loads of moving pieces. Somebody one time thought it'd be fun to bring a Buc-ee's overseas, and I'm like, oh, now you're dealing with petroleum too? I mean, it's a lot. There's a lot involved in these things. So let's talk a little bit about inspiration, right? What would give you the inspiration for a certain business, right? What should you choose? Where should you start thinking? So I think one good place to start is thinking about your own workplace. Now, I understand that in this program, we've got some different demographics, right? We have some students who are adult professionals and you've been in the business for a while and you know your own business and you know a lot, and a lot of people also who are on the younger side and you're fresh out of college and maybe you don't have as much professional depth yet, but you're working on that. Well, for those of you who actually have some experience at a business, you might have a lot of institutional knowledge that might help you take this business and hypothetically move it overseas. You need to make sure that your workplace doesn't have a global presence, but it is possible to start thinking about like, in what ways can we capitalize on that, right? Can we produce something someplace else that might help us? Can we outsource something? Can we open a location someplace? There's all sorts of different ways that you can do a business plan that involves an expansion of your business, and your knowledge might be really helpful. There was a guy one time who decided to take his business, which was a food brokerage, and move it to Brazil. If you're not familiar with food brokerages, they're basically middlemen, if you will, between producers and distributors, or I should say the grocery store chains and so on. They determine prices and all this sort of stuff. But anyway, he worked for a food brokerage. He was a manager there. And because he had so much knowledge of the industry and of his job and of his business, he did a really, really convincing presentation. And by the time it was all done, I was like, dude, you should do that for real, man. There's some VPs who think this is a great idea. And that was a tough one for me too, because I know how complex the grocery industry is and how difficult, or I should say how different it can be between different countries. So that was a pretty persuasive case. So I think that's a good place to start. Think about your own business and see whether or not it's a good candidate for you, assuming that you like it. And that's another thing. If you don't like your job much, then maybe you don't want to spend more time there. Second, I would say, if you're on the younger side particularly, think about a future career. Is there a place you want to work? Is there an industry that interests you? Is there a business that you like from like, I'd really like to work there? And so think about that a little bit. Maybe that would be a good place for you to think. A local company that you like, I should say any company that you like, but local's kind of cool because I've had some students interview people from local businesses, get to know them. You can get information from them sometimes, products and so on. It could be a cool relationship. Sometimes they've led to job and career opportunities too when you get to know people in the community, particularly if it's a business that you really like. Another thing, maybe just something that you purchase, something that you enjoy, something you're invested in. I mean, I don't know what it would be. I don't know, maybe you like comic books and you want to open a comic book shop someplace. Actually, that'd probably be a lot less complex than some other forms of stores, right? But, if that's what you love and you really think that would be a cool thing to do, make it fun. Go for it. I will add this. I've seen a lot of students try to replicate different businesses that they've done from one course to another. Like, I've done this business in the previous class. I know a lot about it. I've got a lot of research, so I'm going to piggyback on that and do the same thing, try to build on what I already know and do it in this course as well. I don't think there's anything wrong with that sort of in the abstract, but if I were you, I would much rather pick a business that you really love as opposed to one that you know a reasonable amount about. You are going to be immersing yourself in this project for 8 weeks, and this isn't an easy class, and this project's going to take a lot of time, and not every part of this project is going to be super exciting for you. I think some of it you're going to be like, whoa, this is really cool, but I hope you're going to think it's more cool if it's something that you like, because then it will help you get through those parts that are not maybe your favorite things to do. So here are a few more things to think about in terms of how or what company you should pick. Number one, are they really domestic? There are some people before who want to take a McDonald's and move it as a franchise to some country where it doesn't exist, right? Because McDonald's doesn't exist in every country in the world. But that's not really the spirit of what we're talking about here. We're trying to look at a business that does not have a global presence and move it to someplace else. There are ways you can find out, right? What I do when students do proposals and I'm like, I don't know, I'm not sure about that, is I go to Google, I do a Google search. Does X have a global presence? Whatever, not the company X, but like whatever business it is, right? The X factor, right? Does it have a global presence? And Google will immediately say, yes, it does, or no, it does not. And you probably should check that out yourself. Make sure that you really do have a business that does not have a global presence. Second, you do not have to move the entire business to another country. There's different parts you can do. As I suggested before, you can outsource something in your existing business, or you can make a component or something. Like, it doesn't have to be like, I have this brick and mortar place and I want to make another one in Colombia or something. That's you don't have to do it that way, right? There's lots of ways you can do international business without following that specific model. So here's some examples of things that people have done before, things that you might do. One student in the past did an export where they found a local whiskey distillery that they really liked, and then arranged to have that whiskey being sold in another country. And again, it was cool. He really liked the product. Hey, what's wrong with whiskey, right? It's awesome. And learned a lot about how that works, the politics and the business and the economics behind it. It was really a cool project. I've had a couple of students in the past who actually were running a business at the same time as they were going through the MBA program. And this one woman I'm thinking about, right? So she had clothes manufactured in the United States, and then was selling it as an e-business online. And she started investigating, would it be cheaper to make some of these clothes in another country? And so it was something that actually directly benefited a real business that she was operating on her own. Another idea, expand pharmaceutical sales. I had somebody before take a pharmaceutical product and check to see whether or not another business, or I should say another country, would be open to the export and sale of that business there. And it was a little more detailed than just an export thing. He actually had to send a sales rep down there and try to make it work like that. But that's another model. That was another idea of something that was done. Somebody once had an outdoor equipment store, and the idea was that they didn't own it, but they was just hypothetical. I think they were thinking about REI or something and moving it someplace else, as I recall. But then what they realized is that it would actually be less expensive for them, instead of moving the store there, and less problematic than just acquiring another store. And I think it was in Kenya, in Nairobi. And there was a store there, and it was doing okay, but not great. But what would the benefit be in some company like REI acquiring that store, and how would you do that? So that was another sort of model as far as something that you could do. Somebody once asked me what I would do if this were my project. And I sat and I thought for a while, and I'm like, hey, here's a fun idea. I have not just this YouTube channel, but I have a YouTube channel of music that I have written and performed with people. And wouldn't it be cool to try to create an export market for the music that I create? How would I do that? And so if there's some sort of like little creative thing that you do, or some sort of business, or something that a friend does, maybe you can make that work too. I don't know, it would be kind of cool. You can make my business work. There's an idea, and I'm kind of serious about that. If you've got some ideas, let's take Mark global. So that's about all I got on company selection. If you've got questions, or if you've got ideas, just run them past me. I'm happy to talk with you, and I'm sure you'll come up with something great, right? So just let me know, pick my brain. I'll help you out any way I can. What's coming next is we're going to start talking about cost, benefit, and risks in terms of country selection. So that is not which company am I doing, but where am I going with that country? So there will be more on that in the next video. So let me know if you got any questions, and good luck to you.